this recording real quick. You know, the difficulty for me as a pastor about being a visionary is that my job is to make all of you better visionaries. And so it's really easy for me to focus on you and not on me. And at least part of what visionary is, because we can all be the prophet in the other person's life to say, here's what you need to do to get fixed, right? If you keep going down that road, here's where it's gonna take you. But in reality, truly being a visionary is not that simple. Here's what Rollo May said in the book. If you do not express your own ideas, if you do not listen to your own being, you will have betrayed yourself. And so at least part of what you have to do is listen to yourself in its goodness and in its not so goodness, right? And try to figure out how to speak out of that space. And it's much simpler to just fix somebody else than to also let that vision affect you and change you. So you might have seen, as we were going through the first part of the stuff here, that much of it is saying that we have to figure out how to take not just the vision that we have, but how to effectively communicate it. So it talks about timing and context, delivery of content, the tone of voice, the body posture, all these different things that are much more multifaceted and challenging to us, so that in essence, we get down to effective visions, not just scream off the wall visions. So why do you easily go to the scream off the wall visions? Scream down at that populace that all needs to repent and be better. Why is that an easier type of vision?
It's a reflex.
It is a reflex. You're right. And this and what this is saying is much more thoughtful, isn't it?
Yes.
What else?
I'm still a little lost there. I know that I have particular positions about certain subjects.
Yes.
And I tend to respond to certain ways until something confronts me that I cannot stay with the same thing.
Yes.
And I mean, I'm really in the midst of all that myself right now, because I'm writing my memoir. And what I'm running into is the part of my memoir that I wrote about the 1960s is coming back to me, because I know what I wrote. I know what I wrote. I may have done it a year and a half ago. And so now I'm up against what's going on now. So I'm going back and looking at what happened with the Lerner Commission that was about, that Johnson put about why were there the kind of thing we're having now, the riots in 1967. And I'm learning an awful lot about how I felt then compared to how I want to feel now.
Yes.
It's the same darn thing. Do you remember that?
I do, very distinctly.
And I looked it up on Wikipedia, and the Smithsonian said they got it right, but failed to act.
Mm.
And so we're repeating the whole thing all over again 50 years later.
Yeah. It's hard, isn't it? Because so much work was done in the 1960s in all of these areas that we think that we got it fixed right. The problem is that we didn't finish because of that. Because we moved so,
the money.
Yeah, we've moved so far that we thought that was enough because it was so much better then. And the ongoing visionary has to be something that inspires in people a choice to continue moving.
I made a mistake. I said Lerner. I meant Kerner.
Kerner.
He was the governor of Illinois.
Okay.
And Johnson commissioned him to look into what was all going wrong. And they decided everybody was afraid. Guess what? Everybody's still afraid.
Everybody is still afraid, huh? And you see that a lot. If you're talking to just about anyone, either your friends or your enemies, so to speak, politically, if you're talking to anyone, you'll hear a lot of fear in what people are saying back to you.
Yeah. Am I on the subject though? I'm not. That's why I was.
Yeah.
Stating.
The hard part about today is that we're living in a moment this last week that has been very difficult, very non-visionary, but with possibilities of what could be. One of my arguments this week on Facebook was with a friend, a good friend who does a lot of really good things, but it was about, she's busy defending, do you know about 10 or 15 police officers have been hurt in all of this? My point was, yeah, do you know about that thousands of other people, innocent people, have been hurt in the midst of all this? And you're so busy focused on those 10 or 15 that you're missing the thousands. But yet that's what we all do, isn't it? Our vision gets focused down to something that we worry about instead of a larger picture that the moment might be calling into us. And so we're all at a certain amount stymied by this week, because the president marching behind tear gas and rubber bullets to hold up a Bible did not inspire me very much at all.
Upside
Really?
down.
I thought all pastors were happy with that.
Oh yeah. And what was even harder is the folks that I knew who were happy about that and trying to say, how do I be a visionary voice in their life when they're seeing something as good that I see as bad, evil even? How do you help speak into that? And so we all had, and I spoke to folks, I heard them, my conservative, opponents, I heard them having some of the same type of frustrations differently than mine, but also not being able to be in a completely clear and wonderful, easy space. But maybe that uncomfortability is what truly gets us to grasp a vision beyond ourselves. Because if we're comfortable, we don't usually look for a way out. Do we?
No.
We sit there in our easy chair and say, yeah, everything's okay. And at least part of what vision should do, not just to the other person, but to me, it should challenge me to move, do something, be something. So
I think you have to have an authentic vision of who you are before you can have be that to someone else. But I like people who have this intense vision that Trump is all good. And my best friend moved back to Kansas City to take care of her mother in Hutchinson, Kansas. And she lives in a hotbed of Trump country.
yes.
I mean, it's very Trump supported there, and she's very anti him, and she starts feeling crazy. And it's so much so that they did a civics class. They showed Fox News in a civics class.
Okay.
And it's like I keep trying to share our common vision with each other because she keeps thinking she's crazy. And I'm like, you're not crazy. You're in a crazy situation.
Yeah. Yeah. And we all are. But that's why we have to figure out how to strengthen self as we move towards a visionary process. If all we're trying to do is yell at the other side, all we're trying to do is just fix something else, then ultimately it will drive us crazy. The visionary has to be grounded solidly in things. Not things that make them not move, but things that make them move. And so at least one of the empowerment tools is bell work. And that bell is one of those things that almost by its very nature, as you ring it, it doesn't let you just hear it and go by, right? The length of the bell sound and how long it continues forces us to look beyond. The way it rings across the community with the old school bells and calls people towards. It helps us to see more than what it is. Because, you know, if the church bell rang on a Sunday morning, I'm sure there were a few farmers that were still out there going, but I got this one more task to do. I got this thing that ought to be done right now. And yet the bell rings calling us towards. And so when we use a bell, it's kind of trying to draw us outside of and remind us of things that right now we're not reminded of. In yesterday's class, I gave the class a little task to do. And it comes from practice from the community where Thich Nhat Hanh is at. And they say they have a bell down near the front desk that every time it's rung and everyone hears it, they're supposed to stop and remind themselves of a deeper truth and go back to that in the midst of whatever it is that right now is taking their attention. So if you're washing the dishes, you stop and remind yourself of a deeper truth, right? And you look and remember once again. And I think we all need to do that on a regular basis so that we're not just distracted from, but drawn deeper into. So what helps you to do that? Maybe it's a bell and the ringing of a bell.
That hurts my head when you
All
do
right.
that. Certain bell tones make me absolutely,
Yeah,
I can do the deep gongs, but that hurts.
yeah.
Sorry.
No, it's all right. So what do you do in the midst of that? What do you do when a bell rings, calling you to something?
Meditate and mindfulness. The practices that I use every day.
Good.
We live where sirens go by our house every day, over and over. We're on Grant Road, east of Craycroft. They're on their way to the retirement center down by Costco. And
Yep.
we know that lives are ending there every day.
Yep.
And
Or maybe they're heading the other direction to the hospital too.
they come back from the
Yeah.
hospital too.
Yeah.
And I mean, each time we hear that, it's a strong reminder that our life has its fragile aspects.
Yeah. But that's not a bad thing for us to remember, because then it says, take into perspective the wholeness of things and start doing things differently than just having to fix that one person that you think is wrong. But think larger than just that. A true visionary has to have the largest possible vision. And I do that every single day, all day long. I know the rest of you are really bad at it. Right? Because we all get caught up in the small picture.
So one of the things that I've done also is, I can be easily annoyed.
Mm.
And it's easy, what I've had to learn to do, and I've said to some people in relationships, I had to learn to love the things that were annoying about somebody else.
Yeah. Yeah. Because at least on some level, you've got to say that our perception of God, the divine, is that God loves that person, and God doesn't love them in spite of them being annoying. Somehow God loves them even with that annoyance. And so our job is to try to step towards that same place, right? No matter how much it annoys us, right? Hi, Sari, how are you?
Somebody else.
Hi, okay. How are you doing? Guys doing?
Good to see you.
Thanks.
We're talking about the empowerment tools of the visionary. There's 4 of them that they point out. We talked about bell work and how that calls us away from and towards something else, calls us beyond what's in our path. But there's a couple others that do that also. The first one that she identifies is singing. She talks about power songs. And those power songs are that which tell us a vision that may not be true right now, but that we need to believe is true as we move towards. What brings us a power more than just this moment? For you, what is a power song? When you listen to it, what it draws you further, calls you beyond yourself?
If nobody else goes right away, I will tell you one that you may know the actual title. I don't, because that song is used at St. Francis frequently. But the lines are, "Who will they send? Send me."
Yeah, Here I Am, Lord, it's called.
Yeah, and the music was the song to sing at my wife's ordination.
Nice. And it's often sung at ordination, because ordination is at least one of those spaces where you're saying, I'm following a voice that's different than whatever I might have listened to before that moment. I'm going into a new space, which is what visionary things always do to us. It draws us to the new space. And so we have to remember what's the empowerment of that. And that song's a good one that way, because it definitely calls us to openness to that new call. Who else has a? Oh, go ahead.
We had to leave everything we owned.
Yeah.
And it was absolutely terrifying.
Yeah. Who else has a power song?
I think the one we've been singing recently of Pauline Near is the I Am Willing.
I Am Willing. Good. Does everyone know that song? I am open and I am willing for to be faithless. How's it go? Would be so strange, I think it is.
Be hopeless, be so strange.
To be so hopeless would be so strange. So it's that sense of not being afraid to open yourself up to this new experience, whatever it is. This week.
She captures that same thing too in Singing for Our Lives that we use.
Yes. She does a good job singing the anthems that help us see more than what we are. But then many of the great movements are typified by those kinds of songs. We Shall Overcome from the 1960s, Racial Things, is a very powerful song, because that's exactly what had to happen. It wasn't that movement wasn't successful because they ignored the walls, the hatred. It's because they moved in the midst of that struggle and overcame. And it called.
I've been just reminded of this last week is oh, now I'm going to lose it. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes.
Yeah.
An old spiritual.
Yeah.
And the verses don't make a whole lot of sense to me necessarily, but that verse it's like we shall overcome, in that we just can't give up.
Yeah. And at least part of the whole visionary movement is trying to say, I know it's not here yet. Keep walking towards it. And the hard part is that there's no guarantee that you even make it to the vision, right? But the vision drives you closer to it. I had conversations with both my sons this week. One who's sitting in the middle of New York, as everything happens there. Went on a march yesterday. Yeah, yesterday from I can't think of the name of the bar where the gay rights movement started. What was the name of it?
Sullivan or
No.
No. Yeah.
Stonewall was the movement.
What?
Stonewall was the movement.
Stonewall.
Yeah.
Thank you. But that so started at Stonewall and went to Union Park. Marvelous thing to be a part of as he's moving into what might change the whole future, his whole future, right? What will it all look like on the other side of that? Then my other son, who lives right off of Loring Park, within a couple miles. In fact, a couple of years ago when I was there, he took me to a little hamburger joint where we ate a Juicy Lucy, which was a mile from where the man was assaulted by the police
In Minneapolis.
in Minneapolis. So they're right in the center of much of what's going on here. And I want him to, I looked at him and I said, essentially, figure out how to sing the songs of right now so that it changes your life, right? So that you're not the same afterwards. Eric works with a lot of kids from Minneapolis. He's a teacher, severe handicapped, mentally and physically handicapped children, and many of them of color. And so he's working with populations that need to hear a different story, both from their teachers and from the world around them, that tells them something different than what they've heard before, both because of their handicap, but also because of their color, because of a whole lot of different things about them, maybe their poverty. And his job is to say, but you are something different, are something more.
A
I have
power
a-
song.
Go
Oh,
ahead.
go ahead.
I'm just gonna say I have a playlist of women's power songs, and Katy Perry has one different, and I play that, and also the John Lennon song Imagine,
Yes, thank you.
a whole lot to me.
My little friend Kate, everyone knows my little friend Kate. She's 5 years old. And she comes in here pretty often. I've been missing her, because of this isolation. But she comes in and she asks me very often, let me listen to music. I want to hear That Girl Is on Fire.
Yeah.
Right? And that's one of her power songs. And I love playing it for her because I want her to be able to hear that she can be on fire. And I'm giving her permission, and encouraging her to be that.
A power song for me is I Am Woman, Hear Me Roar.
Nice, good song, absolutely. So we need to sing those songs. We need to share those songs. We need to do it both individually and communally. One of the things I loved about this, though, is that they also said one of the things you ought to do is you ought to, that sometimes the most powerful songs you sing are the ones you create. And that doesn't mean that you actually write a song and that anybody else would ever sing. It is about singing the music that is within you in some way or another. Does that make sense? And you may write a song, but maybe nobody else ever hears it. But it's the writing of something that sings in you, that becomes a melody, a march, a dream of something. And that's
I,
what?
I studied with the Foundation for Shamanic Studies, and so I learned shamanic journey work. And during one journey, after a couple of years of practicing, I was given a song that's it's very personal. It's really like it suits me well,
Not,
but it's really something that wouldn't be somebody else's anthem. But it was really a remarkable feeling to receive this song, and I've certainly sung it many times.
wonderful. Thank you. Because that's exactly what we have to do, whether or not it ever becomes something for anyone else. I love that kids from being very young, I mean 1 and 2 year olds, are already singing. And they're not singing sometimes anything that's even coherent to the rest of us. Maybe it's a song they heard somewhere, but I think more likely it's just vocalizations that are singing out their soul at the moment. Because I think our souls vibrate more on the musical level than on the speech level. And so I think when we don't sing, when we don't encourage ourselves to be in that whistle while you work type of mode, I think we miss out on something.
So
Tim, I'm wondering about whether some power songs go toxic. And I'm thinking particularly of some patriotic songs that now make me cringe.
Yes.
Some of them. I mean, Glad to Be an American.
Yes.
Not everybody can sing that song.
Yeah.
And maybe none of us should sing that song until it's right.
Yeah.
And I mean, there's a genre like that. I was really careful when I was teaching some of those patriotic songs to small children, because when they learn a song, it stays with them for the rest of their lives.
Yes.
And if it's a song claiming we're better than anybody else, that thought is imprinted, and it's really hard to get rid of.
But you know the best example of that, Judy, don't you? Back in the what shall I call it? The whitening of America stage of the last century, right? Bess Smith made famous a song that is still sung a lot to this day called God Bless America.
Yeah.
Right? And it is used very often to say, God bless my America. God bless whatever I think is good and right and everything. And there was a certain man who hated that song. But instead of just fighting the song, he wrote a different song. His name was Woody Guthrie, and it was the song, This Land Is Your Land. And he held up a different vision with his song than what he felt like God Bless America was holding up. And I think sometimes that's what we have to do, is sometimes not try to fix what's wrong with as much as hold up a new vision, different vision of what can be. And at least that's part of what the visionary is about, is trying to get people to move towards that different vision that has been planted in their soul somehow or another. The hard part is it means that you may not convert everybody, but maybe that's not the job of your vision. Jesus worked more with 12 people and then let them change the world rather than him changing the world. Maybe he didn't have to solve all of the issues of his day, but he had to do something deep enough with some folks that it didn't die. So as a visionary, who are the people that maybe you need to work with most? And who can you just set off to the side and say, I'll let somebody else have that vision work? It's tough because we all want to fix everyone.
It's more than that, Jim.
Yeah,
We all want to save the world.
we do. We do.
Mhm.
And I don't know if you saw that you've been traveling. I put up a Rumi post yesterday that said, yesterday I was smart. I wanted to save the world. Today I'm wise, or I wanted to change the world. Today I'm wise. I'm just going to change myself.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that at least part of the maturing process is a coming to a space of where you realize what your sphere of influence is and what your realistic and good sphere of influence is, that you don't have to fix somebody 1,000 miles distant, but then maybe this group right here is the group that you change.
One of the expressions that I've used is, I'm having a very hard time taking care of my friends. I can barely take care of myself.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I can't teach you because I haven't given myself enough learning to become what I want to be, and keep using that and work with that kind of tool, manipulate the words around. Because I mean, I learned the only person I could change was myself when I was part of the 12-step program.
Yep.
But I have to be able to have the courage to speak up.
Yeah.
I have to be able to vocalize my own self, which you brought up at the very beginning here.
Mm-hmm.
I cannot hold back and wish. I've got to stand up for what I believe and represent, even if it's only with my own particular behavior. How my character counts.
Yes.
My dependability counts.
Right.
In other ways that can do that.
But much of that goes down to the next empowerment tool that we haven't talked about yet, and that's meditation, contemplation, prayer. And they put all of those together because I think she wants you to see this in a very different way than what you typically do. Too often when we do prayer, we talk way too much about talking, right? Speaking words. And she speaks here more about accessing something beyond ourselves, something more than just us. And so it's more of a listening and hold on. It's more of a listening, and she talks about walking and moving meditation. And so it's not a right now grasping it perfectly, but moving and carrying it along as you try to grasp it. Because when we try to talk and make that all of prayer, we're kind of making it, she used the term non-local. And much of what we do tends to be very local. What are my concerns? What are those things right here? And it doesn't draw us into what the larger may be speaking to us. And so the meditation, contemplation, prayer that she's talking about here is how do we let that larger, that divine, move in and through us? What are your practices that help you to be able to do that?
I always begin my prayers asking for guidance and discernment.
Yeah.
And to discern what's coming at me, not even just to listen to it, but
Yeah.
to be quiet enough to go beyond my own thoughts, my own feelings, my own fears, and try and discern the message you're giving me, the message that Mike's giving me, or the homeless guy that's asking me for a buck I don't have.
That's right. That's right. How about the rest of you? Where do you become non-local? Not outside of your self, what's important to you?
I always invite a spirit of love and light, of compassion, and empathy into the present. And then move towards what I'm grateful for. I'm not one who begs God for this or that. I want to live a life of being grateful and asking to lift up the situations for healing that I know about. And that's the process that I use.
Good. Good.
For me, I think it's quiet. I have some, I gather my solitude and quiet around me sometimes like a warm glove.
Uh-huh.
And to nurture myself, especially when I'm in pain, a lot more pain than usual. But it helps me, I can almost feel this warmth growing inside of me, and it just helps me. It helps me when I have that then to interact with other people.
Good.
And I know when I walk Ginger, I notice a lot of people with their headphones, and I'm like, do you ever have quiet in your life? It's like you have to have something in your ears every minute when you're walking meditation thing. That's really cool too. But
yeah, part of why she holds up walking meditation is for is so that as we're moving along, we can't quite hold on to anything, right? The flower, we can see it, but we don't just look at the flower. And so it's an attempt to try to push us beyond just what's most readily apparent to us, the thing we stop at. But we don't let go of it. That flower that sits beside the road maybe comes and we continue to see it and carry it, and it changes us as we move further along too. But it also allows for other things to come in and mix with it. So somewhere in the midst of it, when you're walking and moving, your mind, because you're pretty good at walking and moving, then your mind doesn't really have to think about it any longer. And it has the ability then to wander, be non-local, and maybe hear something beyond just that, so that hopefully you have creative problem solving that happens in the midst of it.
Is that the same principle of sitting in meditation and just acknowledging all your thoughts that come by and say yes and let it go?
Yeah, but it does it in a different way. The other is trying to clear your mind, right? And be in that space of clearness, where this is not necessarily that. It's that you can't really, because of the effort, the movement, you can't really just hold on to anything. And so you're letting things pass through, but letting them have an effect on you. And oftentimes it's the way of being able to take two things and suddenly see the connection between them in ways that you hadn't before. So 1 minute you're thinking about thing A, and 3 minutes later you think about thing B, and you go, oh, and suddenly they work. Not because you're trying to make them work, but because the space allows that to happen. There's lots of different types of meditation and prayer, and the problem is that we tend towards one kind because it's worked for us in the past. But the problem is if we've prayed the same type of prayer for too long, there may be a really good chance that it's not working as well as what it used to. Because our mind, our spirit has gotten used to however it is that whatever it is we did with that prayer, and now we no longer get the same thing. Or we do get the exact same thing, and we hear what we heard last Tuesday, and the Thursday before that. And that's no longer being drawn into a vision. And at least part of what we're trying to do is get drawn beyond ourself.
Some of my favorite times were in the old days when I used to do ironing, which I avoid at all costs now.
Mm-hmm.
It's a good chance to just be quiet, and that kind of rhythmic movement and the freshness of the steam and all that
Yes.
just really helped me. The other thing is doing dishes, and especially after a party, I never wanted anybody to help me with the dishes. I just wanted to remember as I washed up.
Everybody knows the story of Brother Joseph. Have you heard that story? Brother Joseph is in the Little Flowers book. And he was a monk. And he, the story is about him finding God in the midst of doing dishes. That in that act of servanthood, of devotion, is where he was able to just open his heart to how the divine was present. And if the divine could be present in the midst of washing dishes, where else could the divine be present?
When I go into my backyard, and I've got several rescued box turtles and desert tortoise, and I change their dishes or feed them. It's really nice. It takes me out of myself, but there's also what you're talking about, that rhythmic, you know, I walk a certain number of steps, I pick up a dish, I dump it, you know, put it on the pile and so forth. And it's a really nice time where I do kind of clear my head. I'm outside, I'm watching them and kind of seeing what they need. And it helps me get out of myself.
Yeah.
And just be fully present.
Yeah. Simone Weil, and you've got this quote in the handout I gave you last week, said, absolute attention is prayer. And sometimes when we try to pay absolute attention, we pay no attention at all. And so when we do this type of thing, but do it very mindfully, very intentionally, we can be very present to what needs to be, what is speaking to us in that moment. We can give absolute attention.
I'm with
And of course-
Judy. When I get too involved in my emotions and what's going on with things I can't control, I get on my hands and knees and scrub my floors.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's a meditation in those types of activities as well.
Yeah. That slows you down and takes you away from some of that other stuff. Sarah, you were about to say something.
Yeah, I was just going to add that, of course, because they're animals, they can't talk to me and tell me what they need. And so I have to look in their faces and see who's running around a lot and who's, you know, definitely wants some food and who's not wanting food and that sort of thing. I have to really be observant. And that also helps me get out of myself.
Good. So we should go to the last section of this. It's about the shadow aspects. What gets in the way of us being a visionary? The first thing is the false self system. That we see something false about ourselves, and because of that, we become unwilling to tell the real truth. And she gives 4 ways that happens. We edit our thoughts, we rehearse our emotions, we perform what we think people want to see, we hide our true selves. How many of you are guilty of at least one of those? What do you do when you find yourself in, how do you stop yourself from doing that? Where you're getting caught up in a false self and not telling the truth even about yourself, let alone about what the other person needs to see. Here are the 4 things, by the way, again. So editing our thoughts, rehearsing our emotions, performing what we think people want to see, and hiding our true self. How do you do that? When do you do that? Maybe is a better question.
This morning, in a Chrysalis meeting, we had this very discussion about racism. And one of the men said, "We are all racist."
Yeah.
And that really struck me in a way that I hadn't considered.
You know, Mike, oh, go ahead.
And I think that is hiding my true self.
That's right. I think one of the worst lies that we tell in racial issues today is that we're not supposed to be racist, or that we aren't racist, that I've been raised better, I've moved beyond that. And much of it's because if we look back into our history, we are better than we were before the 1960s. But we aren't fixed yet. And we all, today, one of the worst parts of racism as we have it today is privilege that we don't even see.
Yeah.
What is it that I get to do as a white male in America that not all of the people around me get the privilege of being able to do? Women have a different path than what a man does. People of color absolutely have to deal with the world, and the world deals with them in a way that I don't have to face. Do I recognize that? Or do I just walk in that relatively false space of assuming that I'm pretty fixed? Or do I see where it is that I see my brothers and sisters differently because of their race, even when I'm not trying to?
One of my teachers got me thinking about something. He says, when you're asked about something to do and your mind says, "No way, I'm not doing that," and your mouth says, "Well, I'd be glad to."
Yeah, 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 yeah.
I've done that.
And this one about rehearsing our own emotions, it can be as simple as fine, I'm fine, right? Not truly opening up in that moment, but it can be much, much deeper than that. It can be sitting with that one that person who is very dear to you and not truly telling the truth to that person, either because you know it's going to hurt him or it's going to be difficult or whatever it is, right? And not speaking the whole truth in that moment. But it also makes it so that you guys can't be in that space of total honesty if you don't speak that truth, right?
I read a thing on recently where this black man, he said, "I'm 6'4", I'm black, and I'm buff." And he said, "And I don't walk out of my house in the neighborhood unless I'm holding my daughter's hand with a fluffy white dog next to me."
Mm.
And I thought, you have to have some empathy and some compassion for a man who has to do that. He said, "I cannot walk around my neighborhood by myself without someone calling the police."
Right, right.
So he takes the 6-year-old daughter by the hand with he said, "I have a little fluffy white dog, and then I'm okay."
And do those of us who essentially have pushed him into needing a 6-year-old daughter and a fluffy white dog, do we recognize that that's true? That he has to live in a very different world? Leticia.
I don't know if I've shared this with you, but among people of color, there is a considerable movement to not let anybody have conversations with us in terms of racism.
Mm-hmm.
The feeling is if we enter into that conversation, we're propagating it passively.
Mm.
Yeah.
And many of the people that I know that were practicing this, we don't use that word. We don't use words like any kind of phobia, homophobia, transphobia, any of that. We just call them bigots.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the philosophy is to call our neighbors on bad behavior.
Yeah.
Period.
Yeah.
We don't care why you're behaving badly. You're just not behaving well.
Yeah. In my junior high, as far as I can remember, there were 2 black people, Regina and Roger T. Roger T was dear to me. We ran the mile relay together. But I didn't have black friends. I thought I'm not prejudiced because I got along really well with Roger T. But when I moved down to Texas and 10% of my town were black, suddenly I had to look differently at that. In my junior high, there was, as far as I could tell, about one person that was Hispanic. Her name was Chris Espinosa, and I was more Hispanic than she was. I say that facetiously, because she was very anglicized. And then I moved down to Beeville, Texas, where more than 50% of the town were Hispanic, and those were the ones I ran with. And suddenly, my world had to change, and I had to see things differently. And I realized how much I carried privilege, or carried a white diversion of that world. And I had to change what I had rehearsed and be different. But we all have that. And it's compounded anytime we, in whatever way, give into the I have to be non-prejudice. I think that's what, as I've talked to some of my friends this week, my conservative friends this week, that's what they're particularly struggling with. Well, I'm not prejudiced. Well, yeah, you are. You're just not recognizing it. And they don't want, they've been told that they're not supposed to be so much, and that's the ideal, that they have no permission for themselves to be able to acknowledge that they're not perfect in these areas yet. And yet that's at least part of what we're all having to deal with in America in the midst of George Floyd's death, right? Is that we are still failing in that area. But if we don't recognize it, we don't get better.
It also helps to help people try and figure out what's prejudice and what's fear.
Right.
Because a lot of people operate on fear.
We do. And the hard part is that sometimes the prejudice is where we've taken maybe something that was a fear thing. Okay, so my mom, no, somebody's mom, not my mom, but somebody's mom might have had a bad experience of a black man somewhere in her past. And so had a real moment of fear that was placed into her life, but taught that in a way that turned it into not just a specific fear about one particular way that one particular man did something wrong, but came and generalized it out to a population. And that's where maybe what might have started as a well-grounded fear becomes a poor racist attitude, but one that's sometimes not even questioned. So all of these false self things, rehearsing our emotions, performing what we think people want to see, means that I sit in a space with you which is less than completely whole. And there's sometimes when we have to do that. If we're in a space of hierarchy of any sort, a boss doesn't share her true self with her employees, but needs to figure out how to share as much truth in that moment, right? Mom and dad don't tell everything to their kid in the midst of all this stuff that's going on, right? And so they're less than completely truthful because they know it's too much for the kid at the time. But in that, it's kind of like talking about sex with your kid. It may always be uncomfortable, but at some point you got to do it. And you got to figure out when's the right time to approach those tough moments. And I think we have to do that same type of question about all of these kinds of issues. And if we aren't brave enough to be able to speak into those moments, we will always be less than whole. our time's up, but let me just really quickly go to the other two dysfunctions. One of them is self-abandonment, and that's where we don't hold on to something that is true about us. We give it up in the midst of the relationship. And if I can't come in whole into that relationship, for me to assume I can be visionary there is less than a good assumption. I have to be able to come in with my wholeness in order to truly be visionary in that moment. And there's lots of ways, and you can read through them, ways that we abandon ourselves. Sometimes we do it for love, sometimes we do it for peace, we do it for all kinds of different ways. And ultimately, that's not really good for us. We have to be brave enough to be our whole self, which is why I started where I was at. If we don't know ourselves, if we aren't strong and wonderful within ourselves, we will always be less than visionary, because we'll bring our own stuff into that. And so at least part of the job of becoming the visionary in another person's life is to truly be whole in your own life.
And that's a full-time job
That's a full-time job. Yep,
and a forever job.
and a forever job.
Yeah.
The last dysfunction is projection, where we take whatever's broken about us and we project it onto somebody else in some way or another. And that's rarely helpful, because even if I project a good thing onto you and it's not you, I'm not going to see what I need to see about you. And a visionary, maybe more than any of the other folks of these 4 different paths, needs to be able to see the true self within themselves and around them. So that's the visionary. We made it 3/4 the way through the fourfold way. Next week, we move into our last quadrant. And I'll send out all this information to you as soon as I get done here. All right?
Jim,
Yes.
I'm not on your email list.
You're not?
No.
Will you, in the chat box, type in your email so that I make sure I do it?
Sure will.
If you do that, then I will get it there. All right. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you, Jim. Have a
Thank
wonderful
you.
day, everyone.
Happy birthday, Jim.
Thank you.
Happy
Wonderful
birthday,
there.
Jim.
61 years old now.
Excellent.
My wife always likes that, because for 6 months she's older than me, and then the other 6 months we're the same.